By the end of the last chapter, I found myself asking a question I never thought I would have to ask. Who was I married to? Because the man I lived with didn't feel like the same man I had fallen in love with. At least that's what I told myself. For a long time, I believed I was waiting for him to come back. The thoughtful and attentive version. The man who seemed so interested in my thoughts, my dreams, and my life. He made me feel seen. But looking back now, I realized something painful. I wasn't waiting for him to come back. I was chasing a memory. And memories can be dangerous when they become more real than the person standing in front of you. I spent years comparing who he was to who he used to be, or at least who I believed he used to be. Every disappointment became easier to excuse because I kept measuring it against the beginning. When he became distant, I reminded myself of how attentive he once was. When conversations became cold, I remembered how easy they used to feel. When I felt ignored, I thought about the days when he seemed unable to get enough of me. I kept using the past to explain the present. And that's what kept me stuck. The truth is, I wasn't married to the man from the beginning anymore. Whether he had changed or whether I was finally seeing who he had always been, I still don't fully know. What I do know is that I spent years trying to recreate something that no longer existed. And every time I failed, I blamed myself. I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I wasn't supportive enough. I wasn't understanding enough, or even attractive enough. That question haunted me. Because when you're married to someone who slowly withdraws from the relationship, you start searching for reasons, and the easiest place to look is in the mirror. I remember sitting across from him during dinner one evening. We barely spoke, not because we were angry, not because we were fighting, but because there was simply nothing left to say. The silence felt heavier than any argument, and as I sat there looking at the table, I realized something that frightened me. I felt more connected to strangers at the grocery store than I did to the man sitting in front of me. That's when I began experiencing a kind of loneliness I didn't know existed. The loneliness of being married and sharing a home with someone who no longer seemed interested in knowing you. While entertaining the loneliness of sleeping beside someone, feeling completely invisible. People often think loneliness comes from being alone, but some of the loneliest moments of my life happened while wearing a wedding ring. What made it harder was that from the outside, everything looked normal. We went to events while attending family gatherings, taking photographs and playing our roles. And for a while, I became very good at playing mine. But behind closed doors, the relationship felt increasingly one-sided. I became the encourager. I was holding the marriage together while he was living his best life because nothing had changed for him in the relationship. After all, he was never invested in loving me anyway. He was in love with how it looked to others. And what I didn't realize then was how exhausting it is to be responsible for someone else's emotional needs while your own remain untouched. It felt like I was constantly pouring into a cup that never poured back into me. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough. No matter how much understanding I offered, there was always another reason he couldn't show up the way I needed him to. And because I loved him, I kept giving. When someone is in love with a memory, you tend not to see the reality. The intimacy changed too. Not just physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy. This is where you have to fight hard to not allow the devil to use you to get back at the other person. I had thoughts of cheating and fantasizing about men that I could have spent time with who knew I was being neglected without me even saying a word about what I was going through. Energy can be dangerous if you connect with the right person at the wrong time. And when I tried to talk about it, the conversations rarely went anywhere. Sometimes they end up with excuses or with defensiveness. Looking back now, that's what hurts the most. You start to feel like you're in the marriage alone. Not that I felt lonely, but I started believing loneliness was normal. I convinced myself this was simply what marriage looked like after enough years. Sometimes, couples hit a wall that becomes routine and stale with disconnect. But deep down, something inside me knew better. My spirit knew better. And yet I kept ignoring it. There were also moments when I began wondering where his attention was going. I never had dramatic proof of anything, no shocking discovery, just the growing feeling that I was competing with something I couldn't see. Maybe it was his ego or the admiration he received from other people. I don't know. What I do know is that the energy he once invested in us seems to have found a new home, and I was left carrying the relationship by myself. The more distant he became, the harder I worked, and the more exhausted I became. And eventually, I found myself trapped in a cycle that felt impossible to escape. Most of all, I was chasing a version of him that existed mostly in my head. And one day, sitting alone with my journal, a question appeared on the page that stopped me cold in my tracks. What if this is who he really is? Not who he was, not who he could become, who he actually is. I stared at those words for a long time, because if they were true, everything changed. If they were true, then I wasn't waiting for the relationship to improve. I was refusing to accept reality. And for the first time, I started wondering if the biggest problem wasn't what he was doing. Maybe the biggest problem was what I kept refusing to see. Because the truth is, I wasn't just chasing him anymore. I was chasing an idea and a promise he made me during our vows before God. It was all a dream. And the harder I chased it, the farther away I drifted from myself. But what I didn't understand yet was why this felt so familiar. Why I kept working for love. Why I kept proving my worth. Why I kept staying in situations that left me empty. The answer wasn't hiding inside my marriage. It had been following me long before I ever met him. And that's where this story goes next. Because the more I looked at the relationship, the more I realized I wasn't just repeating a marriage pattern. I was repeating a life pattern. We're not just telling stories here. We're rewriting them.
I kept your name like it was grace. Held it in my chest, held it in place. You left no sign, just a blue door. I kept knocking hard on a painted shore. I was hungry for you, fasting for a ghost, calling out your name at the end of hope. Hands up, eyes closed, till I felt alone, praying for a light in a house of smoke. Chasing a love that was never there, never there. I said amen